Imagine waking up to the news that the United States has annexed Canada. Overnight, the world's largest democracy swells to 400 million people, expanding from the Arctic to the Caribbean. At first glance, it sounds like a geopolitical masterstroke, a vast, unified North America, rich in resources and global power. But beneath the surface, this dream quickly turns into a nightmare. In this video, we unravel why annexing Canada wouldn't just be an impossible feat. It would unravel the very fabric of the United States itself. Annexation isn't a new idea. Since the early days of American expansionism, the thought of absorbing Canada has emerged time and time again. The War of 1812, the Fenian raids, and even whispers during World War II, there have been countless moments when the United States has eyed its northern neighbor. Yet, Canada remains independent. Why? Because forcing such a merger would be like trying to fuse oil and water. To understand why annexation is a recipe for disaster, we need to start with identity. The United States and Canada may look similar on the surface, English-speaking, developed economies, multicultural societies, but beneath that lies a deep cultural divide. Ask a Canadian and an American what their country stands for, and you'll hear vastly different answers. Americans are raised with the ideals of individualism, patriotism, and limited government. Canada, on the other hand, prides itself on collectivism, universal healthcare, and a more diplomatic approach to global affairs. Where Americans see freedom as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Canadians see it as social responsibility, peacekeeping, and tolerance. These ideological differences aren't just minor nuances. They define policy, governance, and public opinion. Imagine trying to force Texas and Quebec into a single governing structure. It would be a political earthquake with no end in sight. But let's assume for a moment that annexation happens. How would the United States incorporate Canada's 10 provinces and 3 territories into its political system? Would Canada become a cluster of new U.S. states? Would it have its own semi-autonomous government like Puerto Rico? These questions alone spark constitutional chaos. The U.S. is a federal republic with strong presidential powers and a Senate that gives disproportionate influence to smaller states. Canada, on the other hand, is a constitutional monarchy, with a parliamentary system that relies heavily on consensus and provincial autonomy. These two models aren't just different, they're fundamentally incompatible. Picture the U.S. Congress suddenly absorbing dozens of new representatives from Canada. Would a senator from Wyoming wield the same power as one from Ontario? Would Canada's bilingualism be enforced nationwide? These aren't just technical issues. They are deep fractures waiting to split the system apart. Politics aside, let's talk money. At first glance, Canada seems like an economic goldmine: abundant oil, fresh water, massive land reserves. But annexation comes with a price tag that could bankrupt the United States. Right now, Canada runs a social welfare model that would be nearly impossible to integrate into the U.S. system. Universal healthcare, publicly funded universities, and strong labor protections, these are pillars of Canadian society. The U.S., with its privatized healthcare and corporate-driven model, would face a financial reckoning trying to accommodate these systems. If the U.S. tried to maintain Canada's healthcare system, costs would skyrocket into the trillions. But if it dismantled it, millions of Canadians would resist with everything they have, leading to political instability. And then there's the issue of resistance. Many assume Canada would surrender peacefully, but history suggests otherwise. The last time the U.S. tried to invade, during the War of 1812, it was met with fierce Canadian and British resistance. Even today, the idea of forced annexation would provoke not just Canadian defiance, but international condemnation. Canada is a NATO member with strong ties to the UK and Europe. Any U.S. attempt at forced annexation could lead to military intervention from allies. What starts as an internal takeover could quickly spiral into a global conflict. Plus, Canada is already deeply integrated into U.S. security networks. It doesn't need to be annexed to be a strategic partner. Trying to force a union would only create unnecessary hostility. But perhaps the biggest consequence of annexation isn't political or economic, it's social. Canadians, whether from British Columbia or Newfoundland, wouldn't simply accept U.S. governance overnight. Protests, separatist movements, and even underground resistance would erupt. Already, regions within Canada have struggled with national unity. Adding these tensions to the US's already fragile political landscape would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. And what about the US itself? Would Americans support such an expansion? Would taxpayers be willing to fund the massive costs of integrating a nation with different values and priorities? Or would this drive America into its most divided era since the Civil War?
If the United States were to annex Canada, the impact wouldn't just be felt within its borders. The world would change overnight. Old alliances would shatter, new enemies would rise, and the global balance of power would be thrown into chaos. One of the first casualties of annexation would be the NATO alliance. For decades, Canada has been a cornerstone of Western defense strategy. Its geographic position, spanning from the Pacific to the Arctic, makes it a crucial partner in monitoring Russian activity and securing the Northern Hemisphere. Canada and the US jointly oversee NORAD, a critical defense system that monitors airspace threats. But what happens when annexation turns Canada into an occupied territory rather than an ally? European nations, already wary of US foreign policy shifts, would see this as an aggressive act of imperialism. The alliance would fracture, and NATO itself could crumble. France and Germany, already pushing for European strategic independence, might withdraw from NATO entirely. Countries like the UK, historically close to both Canada and the US, would face a diplomatic nightmare. Would they support their American ally or stand with their former Commonwealth partner? And what about Canada's standing on the world stage? With its sovereignty erased, its allies would be forced to pick sides. Annexation wouldn't just shift global politics, it could ignite a Cold War within the Western alliance itself. While the Western world scrambles to deal with the fallout, two nations would be watching closely: China and Russia. For years, these global powers have sought to undermine US dominance. An annexation crisis would be their golden opportunity. US-China tensions have been escalating for years, with trade wars, military conflicts in the South China Sea, and the ever-volatile issue of Taiwan. China has long positioned itself as the next superpower. With America tied up in a constitutional crisis and global backlash, China could push forward its interests with little resistance. Taiwan, a prime target for military action. The South China Sea, a perfect moment to expand its territorial claims. And then there's Russia. A divided NATO and a distracted US would leave Europe vulnerable. Putin's long-standing ambitions to reclaim former Soviet territories, Ukraine, the Baltics, even parts of Eastern Europe, would suddenly seem achievable. A world distracted by the US-Canada crisis would be a world where Russia makes its boldest moves yet. In attempting to expand, the United States would inadvertently weaken itself, giving its greatest adversaries the upper hand. What was meant to be a display of strength would, in reality, be a catastrophic own goal. Annexing Canada wouldn't just be a political disaster, it would trigger one of the greatest financial crises in modern history. Overnight, the global economy would spiral into chaos. Canada is one of the world's largest exporters of oil, minerals, and agricultural products. Its economy is deeply tied to global markets, with trade agreements stretching from Europe to Asia. But if Canada suddenly ceases to exist as an independent nation, every trade deal it has would be thrown into limbo. Would Canada's existing trade partners recognize American control? Would they renegotiate deals? Or would they impose sanctions, viewing annexation as an illegal act? Countries like China, which rely heavily on Canadian resources, could retaliate with economic warfare. And then there's the internal collapse. The US would be absorbing a massive welfare state, one with expensive healthcare, social programs, and a vastly different tax system. Funding this integration would either require historic tax hikes or massive cuts to American public services. Either way, the economic pain would be unbearable. The result? Skyrocketing inflation, mass layoffs, and economic stagnation on a scale unseen since the Great Depression. A country that sought to grow would instead find itself shrinking under the weight of financial ruin. But even if the United States somehow navigated the political and economic chaos, one force would remain unstoppable: resistance from within. Canadians wouldn't simply accept annexation, they would fight back. History has shown that forced political takeovers breed rebellion. Quebec's long-standing independence movement would explode into full-scale revolt. Indigenous groups, already engaged in land rights struggles, would launch militant resistance. And everyday Canadians from Toronto to Vancouver would take to the streets in unprecedented protests. The US has learned the hard way that occupation breeds insurgency. Just as Iraq and Afghanistan proved impossible to control, so too would Canada. Annexation wouldn't lead to unity, it would spark decades of guerrilla warfare and domestic terrorism. The dream of a unified North America was never meant to be. Annexing Canada wouldn't just weaken the United States, it could very well destroy it. But the question remains, could such an attempt ever be seriously considered? As we dig deeper, one thing becomes clear. Annexing Canada isn't just unrealistic, it's a Pandora's box that could dismantle the United States as we know it. But the problems don't stop here. In the next chapter, we'll explore the deeper geopolitical ramifications, how annexation could reshape global power, fuel conflicts, and even threaten democracy itself. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analyses on the biggest stories shaping our world today.